All right, good afternoon. I think we are now live in our last session of the day, and I want to welcome everybody back to the virtual table. I know this has been an incredibly energizing day myself. For those of you who have not yet seen me on a screen, I'm Daniela Valley. I'm the current scientific director for the Academic Health Science Network, as well as the BC Support Unit. And I'm joined by some wonderful people today. I'm going to quickly move to introductions and have each person introduce themselves. But before I do that, I do want to recognize that I'm going to be eyeballing the Q&A chat box. So as questions arise or things that you want to hear people address, please do put those there, and I will pass those over to our panelists for the day. So let's start out with introductions. I'm going to ask each person to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself as well as the role that you play. And most importantly, what's the thing that excites you about this idea of bringing pragmatic clinical trials and learning health systems together? So Bev, why don't we start with you?
Oh, great. Put me on the spot, Danielle. Thanks. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Beverly Pomeroy. My daytime job is as a patient engagement specialist with the BC Support Unit Fraser Centre out in Fraser Health Authority. But really, I come to this role as an incredibly active patient partner. Came into this role when my daughter passed away 4 years ago at the age of 16 from a really rare, complex condition. So I kind of wanted to find a sense of purpose, discovered patient-oriented research, and lo and behold, now I'm actually working in the field. And today I'm just really excited actually to represent that patient voice and that piece around patient engagement and where that fits in pragmatic clinical trials in the learning health system. It's such an important voice, and so I'm super grateful to be here today. So thank you.
You always have such great ideas that I'm looking forward to the discussion unfolding. Sterling, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm the president of the BC Academic Health Science Network. I'm also a professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC and a scientist at C2E2 in Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute. So I come to this with a researcher perspective, I suppose. I'm a health economist, and I've always had a very applied focus in the research that I've done, and wanted to bring results to action and to have impact. I think increasingly seeing the need for co-development of research, and very pleased that we've taken forward patient-oriented research in such a serious way in British Columbia, so that we can get the voice of patients into health research and actually get patients as co-leads for health research, but also wanting to recognize the importance of other partners in the health research space, so the frontline clinicians as well as policy decision makers. So that sort of partnership approach to health research, and I think learning health systems in many respects provides that opportunity for us to realize that true partnership that we're trying to create.
Dee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. So I'm Dee Taylor. I wear a couple of different hats, depending on the day or even the time of day. So I'm co-scientific director of the Rural Coordination Centre of BC, along with my colleague, Dr. Nellie Oki. I am also the corporate director of research for Interior Health, which includes, of course, clinical research. And we have some fantastic people. Of course, Colleen Adderley is the manager there. And so we've got some oversight on clinical research. And I'm also a researcher. So today, I think what's really exciting is I was reflecting on sort of this discussion this afternoon, and what really interests me around pragmatic clinical trials and the health systems and learning health systems comes from just over, believe it or not, 25 years of my work career, where I've always had one foot in the health system in some way, shape, or form, and one foot in academia, and really have been interested in health systems transformation and the use of evidence in practice, and how we also consider research broadly, including clinical trials in the health system to help, push forward both health systems improvement, but also, of course, very important on patient care. So with that in mind, I think the caveat today, the lens I'm going to speak from today is going to be the decision maker or the health system's perspective, because I think there's some really interesting things that we can chat about this afternoon around that and this topic.
Thanks, Dee. And last but not least, Hubert, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Hubert Wong, and I'm a biostatistician by training. I am part of the School of Population and Public Health at UBC, though I used to spend most of my time down at St. Paul's Hospital with the CIHR Canadian HIV Trials Network and the Centre for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences. I was seconded to this other position, which is with the BC Support Unit, as the lead for the Real-World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster. And so the purpose of this cluster is to foster development of new methods for the design and analysis of pragmatic trials. And how I sort of came into this was that traditionally, trials have been very, what's the word for it? I don't want to say rigorous, but they've been done in very controlled settings. Okay? And what happened over time was that people started coming to me and saying, well, we want to do this trial, but it's not, we can't have the sort of control that we normally have. And how should we do it? And what I discovered was that some of the ways that we used to do things don't work that well with these pragmatic trials. And so I ended up working on methodology for how to do things properly with pragmatic trials. The Tech for Home trial that was presented earlier this morning is one of those examples. But as a result of that, I sort of became more interested in, okay, well, if we're really doing clinical trials in the real world, how should we do them? And so my research is on the methodology of how to do them, but just more broadly, I've become interested in this whole notion of how can we embed these trials in the learning health system so that we can more quickly get results into practice.
Great segue into the, I like how Dee said it, what we're going to chat about today, because I do hope that this really is a discussion among the panelists today. And I have some questions, as you all know, but welcome you to ask your own questions of each other as we go. Sterling, my first question is actually for you. You and I have had a lot of opportunities to talk about learning health systems and how this fits into healthcare and the opportunities we see for BC. But as we've heard today, pragmatic clinical trials are no small undertaking for generating evidence. So in your perspective and reflecting on the conversations of today, what do you see as an important starting point on really bringing these two things together, these concepts together? You are muted. Oh, you're good now.
All right, okay, right. I would encourage people to use the chat box or the live Q&A, because I think I want to make sure that we have a conversation that is engaging with everyone. But just to respond to your question, I mean, I think the thing that I feel that we need to start with is actually curiosity. We actually want to encourage people to be curious about the work they do, about the work others do, about the care that they're receiving, and actually to think how that could be better. Because I think that for me is the notion of a curious community that we're trying to create is all about them learning, and the framing for me for a learning health system is actually the fundamental thing we need to have is an openness to trying things differently, an openness to thinking that things could be better, and actually encouraging people to reflect on how that could happen. And we shouldn't just make change once we identify opportunities for improvement. We should make sure that we are building an evidence base upon which that change is going to happen. And we might bring evidence from elsewhere. I certainly, reject the notion that, BC is unique and only evidence generated in BC should be used to drive improvement in BC. But we also want to encourage the generation of evidence in BC, as well as drawing on evidence from elsewhere. So I think the notion of community and curiosity that binds the community together with stakeholders, I think is where I would encourage us to be in this learning health system journey. It's thinking about how do we create those communities. And one thing that I, as part of our discussions through the day, one thing that really struck me was the importance of questions before methods. And I do think that's like, a really like profound sort of like reflection. And I'm going to give Lynn Feehan credit, because it was Lynn who brought that notion forward in a conversation. And I think that's really important, that we should be starting with the questions that the community sort of feels are important. And then we should be reflecting on how do we answer those questions in a rigorous way. So we shouldn't be doing pragmatic clinical trials to answer every question. Equally, we should not be doing rapid cycle improvement to answer every single question. So we need to reflect on the question first, and then choose the appropriate method in order to answer that question, which means that I think we want to build true partnerships between those people in Patient Safety and Quality Council in BC, in the health system in BC, in the academic system in BC, so that we actually like have that opportunity to have those true teams, and the patient's voices need to be central to everything we do in that context as part of that community. But I do think that that's really where I would want us to start, is like, let's understand the questions and what are the really important questions, and then move to methods rather than the other way around.
That's a great point. And there was a lot to unpack in that answer, but one of the things that I picked up on was the word curiosity. And I think one of the threads for me today was around language and the words that we use. And Bev, this goes a little bit to you in terms of the words research and clinical care are often kept in two separate spaces. And really what today is about, and some of these conversations around are better bringing them together. And I find sometimes, is it the words that we use? Is it the processes that we have in place? So from your role and really thinking about being a patient champion and having been a patient champion in this space, I would love your perspective on how do we better integrate these conversations or these concepts together?
Well, that's kind of like the black hole of patient-oriented research, and I really sort of playing off of what Sterling was saying about questions before methodology. Well, if we're considering questions before methodology, that is patient-oriented. That is patient-initiated research, which of course is my mantra and my soapbox that I live on every day. And if we're considering that in a learning health system model, really to challenge people to kind of be more explicit, and I think people have heard me say this before today, is that it's not just a learning health system model, that if we want to really integrate patients and talk about these questions before methodology and have this be patient-oriented, then we absolutely need to consider learning health systems as a patient-centric learning health system. And this idea of patient-centric and patient, centered or people-centered really is the bridge, that sort of mitigates the divide between everything that we're talking about today. It's the one commonality in everything that we're doing. And if we're considering pragmatic, clinical trials in particular, I know one thing that's been a bit of an issue there too is that, we have to, when we're determining quality and value, that we have to have it in contextual elements. So we need to ensure that the information collected considers patient health and well-being outcomes, not just health system and biomedical disease factors. So, that'll lead really to this population health and wellness. And then going back to that piece and just challenging people when they're considering a learning health system in a research environment, that it be patient-initiated or patient-oriented. Questions before methodology. That's going to be my new mantra now, Sterling. I'm going to put it on a t-shirt.
Okay, well, if we've succeeded in nothing else, we have a new t-shirt that will come out of today's conference, which is always a good sign of a good conference, correct? So just in related to that, like what pitfalls do you think we might encounter in moving some of these issues forward? And I bring that to the full panel.
Are you asking me specifically, Daniel, to start that?
I'll ask you specifically, but I would welcome other panelists to join.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we're still struggling with is this understanding of patients as participants in research versus patients as partners. I still think it's misunderstood. I still think it's undervalued. I think there are a lot of assumptions that are made about patient-oriented research. I think we have an opportunity to really encourage that understanding and learning in this co-creative process that we're trying to do. I think the biggest thing, if we're talking about a learning health system and pragmatic clinical trials, or a learning health system in general, and we're considering data generated in healthcare, which is what that falls on, is that patients ourselves, if the whole idea of learning health system is about data and generation of data, we ourselves do not have access to that data, even our own data. And it's a huge debate that's going on across our country, across multiple jurisdictions, across multiple provinces, and every health authority, is this idea that patients shouldn't access their data, or what if they access their data and then they're going to assume this. So I think there's still, again, a long way to go. We do not have access to our data. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges if we want to create this patient-centric learning health system, right? So I think that's for me, those are the sort of the things that sort of pop up to the top for me around challenges.
Others have thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in, because I mean, Bev, I think you've done a beautiful job of laying that out. And I would also just add infrastructure in the health systems. If we talk about clinical research in particular, and equity and access for patients to participate in clinical research across this province, then we need to have people that are trained and infrastructure in place to support it. So that's one of the pitfalls, I think, just a bare bones piece. And then I've got some other ideas that maybe I'll talk about later, and just maybe see if others have other pitfalls in this question before I go on.
I think a pitfall is legitimizing activities that are not about frontline sort of clinical care provision in the health system. So actually, I think we need to give people space if we truly want to have a learning system, a space where they can reflect on their practice, reflect with others on their practice, and actually seek opportunities to drive improvement. That should be seen, that needs to be seen, I think, as legitimate activity. Not just legitimate, but actually essential activity if we're going to have real improvement. And that goes to the core of how we organize our healthcare system. It goes to the core of how we pay practitioners in our healthcare system, for example. Because if we pay them on a model of fee for service, then we get volume, but we don't necessarily get high quality. Because the time that is required in order to drive improvement in quality is not reimbursed. So I think that for me would be a piece. Is like we need to legitimize time spent on learning activities.
Thanks for that, Sterling. In this vein, I know that I mentioned I was going to be watching the Q&A, which I am, but if the comments that you're hearing resonate with you, or you have additional ideas, drop those into the discussion forum, because I now realize that when something pops up, I can see that too, and I'm happy to reflect those to the panelists for today. Before I go back to Dee with the question, Hubert, I just want to give you space if you have anything else you want to add to the conversation.
I think I'll delay my comments because I'm going to follow up on what Dee and Sterling said in the question you're going to ask me later.
Sounds great. So then, Dee, I am going to go back to you. As Bev provided that perspective from the patient, the patient view, in order for us all to work, piece has been around culture and collaboration and networks. And as you mentioned, having that role in the health authority, I would love your perspective on how do we actually do this, because there's a lot about the pragmatic aspects of doing research in a pragmatic space. So what tips, ideas, thoughts do you have?
Yeah, thanks for that, Danielle. Because I know we were talking about pitfalls, and that's why I wanted to pause a little bit before I responded. Because I think there's things that we each can do, things that are within our control that actually move this concept of learning health systems forward. And so I'm going to reflect 4 different points just of things that I've seen in my career work, as well as things that I do myself on a daily basis. So the first thing is relationship. From a decision maker perspective, you know, researchers or people that are looking at and have knowledge translation within their mandate takes some time to build a relationship with a decision maker. And I know I know people talk about relationship all the time, but I cannot underscore that enough. It is something that you can do, and it does have a lot of meaning. Have a relationship that is actually authentic in terms of what it is you're trying to get across in terms of that piece of knowledge, or what you're trying to implement in terms of research design. Just take that time to actually have a relationship, and not just from a ticky box perspective, but an honest relationship, and that kind of goes across the board. So that's something that I think is super key. The second thing is language, and this came up a little bit in some of your comments earlier. Danielle and Bev were both commenting on this, and I couldn't agree more. I think from a language perspective, not only do researchers have their own language within whatever vein or field of expertise they have, but decision makers do too. And people know this. So they tend to speak in acronyms. So ask for a definition and ask for what context, what context do these acronyms actually play out in. Super practical. It solves a lot of confusion. It helps with communication, and it also sort of builds upon that relationship piece. The next piece is just recognizing complexity within that sort of thought process of pragmatism. Nobody needs to tell anybody that the health system is a complicated place without control, and so don't expect control. There isn't anybody that I think has control over this massive system. So kind of work with that, roll with it as best you can, and learn to anticipate the unexpected, such as a pandemic. And then the last thing I'll say, just that is within our control, is understanding timing. So from a decision maker perspective, there is no such thing as a typical day. Always have a plan B, and you may even want a plan C or a D. These are the things that, the health system kind of goes at a particular rate. Sometimes it's super fast in terms of timing of decisions. Sometimes, things kind of slow down. But from a timing perspective, acknowledge that, lots of times those decision makers are dealing with very high priorities. And so your important study, which is incredibly important, may need to hold. But again, if you go back through those other pieces that I talked about in terms of relationships that you've built, getting an understanding of language, recognizing the complexity and the pragmatism that involved, the timing piece should be a little bit more palatable to you. So those are the 4 key areas where I would say, from a learning health system, that are foundation fundamental, that may not fit in a particular framework that we've talked about today, but are just some interpersonal and personal things that we each have control over and can enact.
Perfect. Thanks, Dee. So we've got some questions in the chat box, but first I'm going to have Sterling tackle an important one from Helen that asked, could somebody please define a learning health system? So I'm going to pass that one to you, since you were part of a robust discussion about that this afternoon.
Thanks, Helen. This has been a sort of theme throughout the day, I think, is let's be clear on what we mean by the language we use. So the learning health system is really about bringing clinical data. Every piece of data that's generated in the health system should be available to support learning, to support improvement. So I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about by a learning health system. And obviously how we do that depends on the nature of the question. But I think that's fundamentally what we're trying to articulate, is the importance of actually making available the data that are generated as a result of delivering health and healthcare for improvements in learning.
I appreciate that. Hubert, I have a question for you, as you know, but I'm actually going to turn to one of the ones that came up from Selva because it's around the design component. In promoting usage of pragmatic clinical trials, what are some suggestions that review committees, such as drug and technology, can take to support uptake and usage of pragmatic study design by industry? So, for example, more weight given to evidence derived from pragmatic clinical trials.
Yeah, I mean, you're really having to convince the drug companies to do this. Now, it's not that they're not doing it; they do it, and they're doing it more and more often. It seems to me, though fundamentally, they still need to develop that initial product and get their licensing, and so it's much easier for them to do that in the context of a traditional trial than a real world trial. And so I don't think you're going to change their minds about that. All you can do is sort of encourage them to do more sort of phase 4 studies to do things in a more pragmatic way after they've got their product licensed. Sorry, the question's gone from the screen, so I'm not sure if I answered the whole question.
I might have hit a check button too soon. Sorry about that moderator error. But I think that it does get to the point, though, of the different levels of evidence that different people view as important or needed or necessary to make a decision making. There is this tension between what a regulatory body needs. Naomi, I think I've got a bit of feedback again. What a regulatory body might need to make a decision versus what a health authority might need in terms of making a decision. And it's not that, I think it's what you're trying to answer, what you're trying to prove with the information at hand. I don't know, Sterling, as a health economist, if you have other points to add to that. I know this is something that you've thought about in terms of technology assessment.
Sorry, I was reading the chat whilst you were talking, so you caught me a bit off guard. So just repeat that if you could, please.
It's more any reflections you have in thinking about the types of decisions that people are making with different types of data. So in pragmatic clinical trials, the tension that Hubert mentioned around drug companies and the types of evidence that they're trying to develop to inform certain types of decisions may be different than that of the evidence that a health authority may be to make decisions. So just any reflections you would have in terms of the use of that data and how to strengthen or weight it so that it's more.
I mean, I think one of the critical things is going back to like the questions and the level of uncertainty we're comfortable living with in terms of answering the question. I think that then speaks to what research design we might need in order to answer that question, and actually what level of data we might actually want to bring in order to answer such data. So when you're making a decision about a decision about reimbursement of drugs, are we actually going to pay for a particular drug? We actually want to see that it's there's strong evidence to say that this works. It works well, much better than its competitors, and it's affordable for the healthcare system. So yeah, I mean, I think like the nature of the question should drive the response in terms of how we generate evidence and what level of strength of that evidence we require in order to guide that decision.
If I could jump in?
Yep.
So this is directed at Sterling again, and the question is, to what extent do you think it'd be reasonable to sort of require, let's say, a drug company to conduct pragmatic trials to figure out exactly how well their product works before we make some sort of decision about whether we cover it or what we're willing to pay for it?
So yeah, it's an important and an interesting question, and I don't have like a definitive answer to it, because I appreciate that in the context of drugs in particular, that doing a pragmatic trial is likely to be a more expensive venture than doing a placebo-controlled explanatory trial, because the nature of the difference that you're likely to see is going to be smaller. But I think we are obliged to try and do that head-to-head comparison, and it may be that it's through network meta-analyses rather than through new trials that are pragmatic trials in that context. I think there are other ways in which that head-to-head comparison can actually be made without necessarily requiring new trials to be done.
So I'm going to build with another question from the audience that picks up on the level of a hierarchy of evidence. So Colleen, this question comes from you. What are the panelists' views on patient experience as evidence in pragmatic clinical trials? Where does it come in the hierarchy of evidence? And do you think we pay enough attention to the patient experience as evidence? My next question is do I start or end with Bev?
I think my answer is going to be the same whether you start or end with me. Absolutely, patient experience needs to be considered as evidence and be included in the work that we're doing. For me, I guess sometimes I just shake my head. I'm like, why is this still a question? Right? Like, patient-oriented research has been around now for 5 years, right? I know it's not very long in the whole context of healthcare. I understand in healthcare we still have a power dynamic in service delivery, where patients are concerned. But absolutely, I think patient experience should be part of that priority and part of that equation. I don't understand why it wouldn't be. And it kind of goes back to, we were talking about in some of our conversations earlier about co-creation. If we're going to co-create, changes in healthcare or systems or things like that, we have to consider patient experience and their journey the entire way along. So I guess I'm just always baffled when I hear that question, because I just think, to me, it's like, yes, they have to be considered. I don't know if we're doing it well. I don't know if we have methods that are really sound. I think we still have a lot of work in that area, but I definitely think it shouldn't even be considered. It just should be.
So I appreciate that. I'm actually going to turn to Dee now in terms of, from the health authority perspective, certainly patient experience data is important. Can you speak to this in terms of your perspectives? And I'm coming to Hubert and Sterling next.
Yeah, it's interesting that the question included the word hierarchy, because of course there is. And of course, if we're going to actually realize a learning health system, we really need to address that it's not a hierarchy, it's a collaborative process. So patients are obviously incredibly important, and Bev's already put that point out very well. I think from a decision or a health systems perspective, it's not that it's not clear that patient voice is incredibly important. I think where we do have a little bit of work to do is in that research culture within health systems, so that we are becoming a much more research-friendly culture, that we are getting used to asking the questions that Sterling talked about earlier, because I think that's incredibly important as well. And that we're sort of getting in a rhythm where health systems questions come up, and that we automatically think, okay, we don't have the information on this. Where can we tap on a researcher's shoulder to help us? Where do we include, or we always include patients in defining the question, and really have it as a process rather than a hierarchy. I just think it's we got to tilt that hierarchy on the edge so that it becomes more of a lateral process where we can exchange information. So that's where I'd say this is really important. I agree with that term hierarchy, but it's certainly, I think, is something we need to unpack and sort of change.
I think on that thread, and I'll actually ask this from Hubert and Sterling in terms of who wants to tackle it first. Why do you think the word hierarchy would come into that concept, right? In terms of people thinking about patient experience data not being equal to or being at a different level than other types of data forms that we have. So what are your thoughts about that? And it can be either from the trial design component in terms of how does that fit into the types of data we might have access to, or the philosophical components about why hierarchy feels like it's even in that sense to begin with.
Can I go first? All right. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's historical, right? Traditional trials did not worry about things like that. And so when people started worrying about it, it got sort of tacked on. And so that in itself created this seeming hierarchy. But I think that's changing. And in fact, within the real world clinical trials methods cluster that I lead, we actually have a project that's led by Nick Bansbach and Joel Singer And what they're doing there is that they're actually evaluating patient values and preferences and trying to figure out, whether therapy A or therapy B is better for that patient. Okay, so we're no longer at the stage where we're trying to say, well, A is better than B for everyone, but hey, depending on what you value or what you prefer, A might be better for you, but B might be better for someone else. And so I think that's where we're aiming to go, but I agree that we're not there yet.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to challenge the notion of a hierarchy in this context. I actually think that hierarchy, when I hear hierarchy of evidence, I tend to assume we're talking about the sort of approach to generating evidence, not necessarily what type of evidence. So the hierarchy that I'm familiar with is the one that says, that sort of like SACIT, evidence-based healthcare sort of approach that says, like systematic reviews of high quality randomized controlled trials is top, and sort of like case reports is at the bottom. So it tends to be like the approach to doing the research. And, I think that's been critiqued and challenged in itself, but it doesn't speak, it's silent on the nature of the evidence. So when you're talking about the nature of the evidence that should come to play, I actually think that we should be using the quadruple aim to judge that, because I think like, patient experience, patient outcomes, population outcomes, provider experience, as well as cost. I think all of those things need to be at play. And we can't really make an informed or a sensible decision about whether we should be adopting a new approach, a new technology, or whatever, if we ignore any of those pieces. So, I would say fundamentally, patient experience is no question in my mind that is central to driving decisions, or should be central to driving all decisions. But it shouldn't be alone. If we've got an intervention that it scores incredibly well on patient experience, but it's just completely unaffordable for the system, like we shouldn't be adopting it. Period. So I think like for me, I wouldn't talk about hierarchy in regard to the nature of the evidence. I would talk about the quadruple aim. And I think hierarchy is more in terms of research design. And I would then go back and say, we need to challenge that on the basis that, questions should drive methods, and we should actually be open to different methods depending on the question that we're asking.
Thanks for that. And Dee, go ahead.
And just on the heels, I couldn't agree more. And just on the heels of that, from the health systems, that goes to the health systems too, because there could be, or there is, in my opinion, a hierarchy of evidence in the health system. So what in the health system is legitimized as evidence to make decisions. And so I think the same goes for how we consider evidence in health systems, from the research, but also from what we legitimize in the health system as, credible forms of information that we make decisions on.
Yeah, I agree. I know as moderator, I'm supposed to facilitate discussion, but I'm gonna take over here. I think instead of hierarchy, it's really the Holy Grail. And I think the biggest challenge has been getting really high quality and robust data on patient experience and patient report outcomes. But as somebody noted in the discussion forum, digital health, different ways of capturing information where it's not added questionnaires, where it's data that could be more actionable, I think will help us get there. There's a lot to learn about what is good data and what's just more data. But I appreciate the response that it's not hierarchy, but it really is an important component that drives decision making. Okay, now I'll go back to my role as moderator and go back to the questions that have been asked by the audience. So Allison asked the question, can someone please comment on how creating a learning health system within a universal, publicly funded health system might be different than enabling them in a private system? Should it be easier in Canada, or, I'm gonna scroll down, might it be more, wait for it. Oh, there we go. Might it be more challenging? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll take a crack at it and see if others on the panel want to. I personally don't think whether it's a public or private system is going to be the issue. It's the people within that ecosystem. And rather than looking at public and private, I would more look at the research-friendly culture. Like, what's the quality? How are people in that particular system actually taking up evidence and viewing it? Because I think there are some really excellent examples of public health systems in the world where they are learning health systems, where they do have that attitude. So to me, it's more of a question of, does that particular organization, public or private, have an attitude where there's curiosity, where there's attention to those questions, where there's patient-oriented research and patient involvement and community involvement. To me, it's more those kinds of qualities rather than public or private.
Others want to take a crack at it?
I agree that public systems can and are well placed to be learning health systems. I think there are some good examples of learning health systems in the US. Kaiser Permanente, Intermountain Health, and I remember Stephen Lewis, the health policy consultant from Saskatoon, as he calls himself, rather than the other Stephen Lewis. He made this point, I think, quite compellingly for me, is that those systems are very selective about the people they bring in to work there, and this is like part of the selection of individuals. It's actually like curious people who work in those organizations because they're selected to work in those organizations on that basis, in part, to understand that their practice is going to be reviewed on a regular basis, that they're expected to look at their performance relative to their peers or their practice relative to their peers. We need to get people at the early stages in a public system, because we have less opportunity to make that a criterion for selection of who's working in the system. And so I think that's the sort of challenge that I think we have in public systems to really make it a learning system, is that we have less opportunity to be that selective about who's actually part of our system.
Thanks, Sterling. I'm going to continue on down questions because we have quite a few, both questions and comments. Graham, I do see yours. If you're out there, I'm going to end with yours because I think it's a great way to wrap the session, and that's also a heads up to my panelists. There's a question here. I'm interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on to what extent reimbursement decisions, either drug, non-drug technologies, should rely on industry-funded studies. Is it realistic that we can expect to fund generation of such evidence at the level required to inform decision-making without industry? Who wants to take that one?
I can try, and then so that's a great question. I think so. Sorry, Danielle, can you just ask the question about reimbursement? Is the question maybe just let me understand the question? Is it the industry actually funding research as a prime mover in learning?
Yes. To what extent reimbursement decisions, either drug, non-drug technologies, so if it's medical technologies or drug technologies, to what extent should reimbursement decisions rely on industry-funded studies? Is it realistic that we can expect to fund the generation of such evidence at the level required to inform decision-making without industry?
Okay, so I think, again, here's a mixed. I think it's mixed. I think industry comes forward with some excellent opportunity for innovation as well. They do, those kinds of budgets do provide opportunity for infrastructure to move ahead and be within health systems to actually be put in place, and oftentimes so we need it. But on the other hand, we also need grant funded studies where so I don't know if I'm answering the question, because I'm sort of answering it from industry and grant funded. But we need both, and I think both from a fiduciary perspective in the health system, where those kinds of funds actually provide infrastructure money, but at the same time, I also think we need the grant funded that may not have as high a budget, but also allow for that integration of our universities into healthcare when it comes to clinical research. But so I don't know if I've answered that well, but maybe somebody else can take a crack at that one.
Sterling or Bev? Bev, I'm interested in your perspective. Yeah, I think this idea of who funds research sometimes has innovation comes from somewhere, but that also industry-funded research comes with people start to get grumbly about it. So I'm curious from your perspective as a patient, how do you reflect on that, to put you on the spot?
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I'm just trying to think, industry-funded research. From a patient perspective, any research that's going to improve my care and improve the quality of my care or my disease process or stop my disease process, I don't care who funds it, right? So, I want a cure, I want a treatment, I want to have a quality of life. Who pays for it typically is not something, I don't think anyways, that a patient partner would necessarily think about, unless it's for drugs that for diseases and drugs that are rare. And we've seen them in the news lately, right? Where you've got this little kid or the SMA kids who have treatments or haven't had treatments. And in the SMA group, the pediatric group of SMA patients, those families all came together and created their own fundraising initiative and foundation. And they now and did their own trials. And they now have a treatment for muscle atrophy, right? For these kids who typically would die before the age of 2. So, I think there's a variety of different ways to consider who's funding research. But at the end of the day, it's how are we going to help our community? How are we going to stop that disease process? How are we going to find the best treatment of care or the best quality of care? I don't necessarily think from patient perspective, we think who funds it, unless what we want or our particular disease is not being researched, then we get involved with who's funding it. And patients are pretty robust. We find ways to fund research and to fund, treatments and care. So that's kind of, I don't know if that helps or hinders the conversation, but that's just off the top of my head.
No, I appreciate that perspective. We have 11 minutes and I've got at least 2 more questions I want to ask. So before I go to the next question, does anybody else want to tackle that particular topic?
I would just say that this is the model that we've decided to move forward with. And I think it's not one that we should move back on. I think industry trials are incredibly well regulated on the whole. So I think the trial evidence that's funded by industry is definitely evidence that we should be paying close attention to. And actually, there's been some interesting. There was a New England Journal paper which actually compared the same question being addressed by 2 trials. One industry sponsored and the other was not. Came to completely different results. But it determined that actually the reason for that wasn't the industry funding, it was actually the selection of patients. So it was actually the level of pragmatism in the trials that actually meant that you ended up with quite different results.
Thanks for that. Okay, here's another question. It's late in the afternoon and I like provocative questions. So thanks for Selva for this one. Can we discuss the role of using pragmatic clinical trials to aid disinvestment decisions? So when do we stop doing something because we see pragmatic evidence has demonstrated that there's no benefit? Who wants to pick that one up? Hubert, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm not sure that I have a thought about this one. The phrase "beyond my pay grade."
Well, as a statistician, it is an interesting question, right? Because oftentimes we say one study does not a decision make, right? Like you don't have enough evidence off of one study. It's a triangulation of the different types of information that's out there. But when we start to talk about, well, maybe this isn't helpful or it doesn't add benefit, taking stuff away is always difficult. But pragmatic trials are embedded in what's happening in the real world. So you can give the statistician's response, or we can take it over to somebody else.
Yeah, I'll defer to my betters here.
Well, I want to add I want to add an extra question in there. Is what happens when we're doing a trial and the patients are saying, this is not working. I mean, I know that's where the evidence is coming from, but if patients are saying this methodology isn't working for us, even though you may be getting the data and everything that you need, I challenge that as well. You know, who draws the line in the sand?
And I guess I'll weigh in and just say, you know, it's a really interesting question. I agree, it's provocative and to a certain degree, because we're so used to doing more things. We need to do this, we need to do that. So just a concept of where evidence is pointing at to stop doing something, I think is incredibly novel and important to consider. So I think it's a great question that we ought to think about after this conversation has closed as well.
Does the health economists in the room want to take a tackle at disinvestment?
Yeah, disinvestment is an under discussed, under researched area. So, I mean, I would put it into two categories. If we've got evidence to say that something is harmful or just does not work, but we spend money on it, we don't do a trial. We actually just need to stop doing it, and we need to find ways to stop doing it. And actually, that's what Choosing Wisely is about, and I strongly support that initiative. If we've got evidence that points in the fact that it may not be high value, so it may actually provide some benefit, but not enough benefit to justify the time and the expense, then I think maybe we do need to generate new evidence, and that might be a context in which a trial would be justified.
Thanks, Sterling. Okay, we have 7 minutes left. I'm going to pose one more question for the group and give everybody a turn to answer it. And this comes from Graham. Let me get it up here. Sorry, Sterling made the point that time must be provided for learning. Bev, that we have a long way to go in putting the patient at the center of both care and research and infrastructure changes. What is getting in the way of these changes? What is stopping us from simply doing these things? So I ask each of you to say what is stopping us from doing it, and then also what is one recommendation you have for us going forward? Bev, I started with you at the beginning, so I will stay consistent and start with you here at the end.
Thanks. What's stopping us? I still think culture. Right? We have shifted from a done to, done for to a done with, but I still think we have to change culture. I think we all know that. We're starting to, obviously with patient-oriented research being that first sort of chance of doing that. So I definitely think culture has to change from the bottom to the top. I also think you have to have leadership buy-in. So you can decide to do whatever you want, and I can in my department, but if my leadership is not on board and there's no buy-in, I'm not going to get very far in moving the needle forward. The other piece there is capacity building. So we're learning how to do this, and we're evaluating how we do this, and we need to keep learning all those things, and we need to teach other people. So from a patient perspective, I'm a steward of patient-oriented research. I'm creating an environment where fellow patient partners can learn and build their knowledge to also help impact change in the areas that they want to have an impact in. And then the fourth one, I hate to say it, but it's funders. I think funders need to start looking at some of these models, and like we have with patient-oriented research, I'm obviously using that as a big example, but funders, both in academia and with the CIHR, need to start putting in there a requirement, that has to be patient-centered or patient-oriented. And so that's sort of my bottom and top, answer to that.
Thanks, Bev. Dee, how about you? What would you add?
I'm hoping you'd ask me to go next, because all I would say is ditto to what Bev said. I think she laid it out beautifully. And then I guess the only other piece, and this is advice out to the researchers listening in, don't have patience. When we talk about building a bridge between the two worlds of academia and the health system, it's going to take, I think, researchers, they're going to have to do more of the reaching in than vice versa right now. I think it'll change, but I do encourage that patients understand that, while Tuesday X plus Y equals Z when it comes to processes on how to access and get information and navigate the health system, you know, by Friday, you know, 1 + 2e equals z, right? So it changes. You leverage the research departments in each of the health authorities in BC because they're there to help. They're key parts of that infrastructure question that I keep referring to, and we are all working very hard to demonstrate the importance of research. But yeah, that would be my, you know, what Bev said, plus to the researchers, you know, patients understand the pressures that the system is under, especially decision makers who have a very thankless job, but really are good people as far as I'm concerned, and are trying to do a really good job and really do want that information. But we need to, you know, support that research culture by reaching in a little bit more than maybe they're reaching out.
Thanks, Steve. Hubert, what would you add?
Yeah, so again, ditto, and I'll just have a comment about capacity building. And I'm not sure if this is maybe challenging or contradicting what Dee just said about reaching in by researchers. I feel it's more important, and this came up in the breakout sessions that occurred just before this meeting. There's a strong feeling that the people in the system who are on the front lines, the managers, the people delivering the healthcare actually want to be part of this, but you know, it's not in their job description. And so we need to change that. We need to put in people where this is part of their job description. We need these people to be champions to promote the curiosity that Sterling first introduced today. And I mean, if there's one thing that I thought we need to do, that would be it.
Sterling, do you want to bring us home?
I mean, I would say ditto to everything that's been said as well. So I'm probably just going to underscore one or two things. And maybe the piece that I would add is like, what's stopping this? I think ego is a big piece of this. And I think like if people come with huge egos, then they're probably not going to embrace this. And you know, in research, I mean, we're encouraged to be independent. That's the notion of like getting a PhD. You're now an independent researcher, and you're told to like compete with your colleagues, compete with everyone else, and do it on your own, and that breeds ego, and that's a challenge I think that we have, because learning health systems are fundamentally about partnerships, and actually like really understanding that you're bringing a team together, not doing something on your own. So I think like one of the things that we need to reflect upon is how do we deal with ego?
It is interesting when you get your PhD, you have to defend yourself. So it doesn't really evoke signs of collaboration and working together, does it? Just in terms of the words we use. We have a minute to go. And I told the group, you know, we might end a few minutes early. I know it's been a long day, but it's been such an enriching day and such fantastic discussion. So I want to extend my thanks to Bev, Sterling, Dee, and Hubert for a wonderful discussion, to the 90+ people who've been out there adding questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. Do check out the discussion forum if it's also live. There were some great comments made by Wendy, by Jean, and others. So I appreciate everybody's attention and the time today. I think this has been the start of some fantastic work and discussions moving forward. So my thanks to everyone, and also to Clinical Trials BC for giving us the opportunity to bring these two topics together as part of the conference. I wish everybody a great afternoon, and look forward to more conversations moving forward.